tone is for immediate...
Wait a minute. Have you heard?
This is a show to keep you on the edge of your seat.
Citizens of America,
Welcome to the Radiocast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the newest edition of the Radiocast. My name is Joseph Taft. It is Halloween as we record this, Halloween 2023, and I am so happy to be joined by three wonderful co-workers by my side. I have Joe B, I have Jack Ryan, and I have Jack K. A pair of Joes and a pair of Jacks, as I was just saying before. So, yeah, super happy to be in here with you guys today, and we're going to be talking a little bit about a couple of flicks, couple of Halloween horror-y movies. We're going to be talking about an all-time classic by George Romero, Night of the Living Dead, which, you know, kind of changed the game in terms of horror films and independent horror films for the time being. And then we'll also be talking about a movie that predates that, which is The Little Shop of Horrors, the 1960 version by Roger Corman, who did quite a bit of B-list movies, from my understanding. So, yeah, we're going to be talking a little bit about those flicks and our feelings on them, positive, neutral, negative. We'll get into all that. So, firstly, thank you all for being here. Joe, I'll start with you, my man. How we doing today? Happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween. So far, so good. Yeah, I enjoyed both movies. Very different movies. But yeah, first time seeing both of them. I liked them both.
Yeah, definitely. Jack Ryan, what's up, my man? How you doing?
I'm doing great, Joe. How are you doing?
Great, brother. Thank you for asking.
That's great. I loved both movies. Big fan of both. First time seeing both.
Yep.
Like Joe said, they were very different, but both had like the horror elements. Great to talk about on Halloween. I'm in a scary mood, but I think they were good.
Hell yeah, I would agree. Jack, what's up, my man?
Good, I'm doing good. Now, I have seen Night of the Living Dead before this, and actually, since we started doing the old-time movie show, Night of the Living Dead was kind of at the top of the list of movies I wanted to cover on this show. I'd seen it very young, when I was very young, and I'll talk a little bit about that later when we talk about audience reactions to this movie. And I really like it. I love George Romero as a filmmaker. I love his films, so I enjoyed watching this again. And this was the first time I'd seen Little Shop of Horrors. I've seen the 80s remake, though it's technically more of a adaptation of a Broadway play, which was based on the original film.
That's right.
And as I said, I'd seen the 80s movie, so I was curious seeing like what that was based on. I did like the original Little Shop of Horrors. And it was, as you mentioned, I think Joe mentioned, it was two very different films for our Halloween creature double feature.
That's right. Yeah, we did still end up getting to do a creature double feature because real quick, before we really start diving into Little Shop of Horrors and all the other wonderful things we're going to get into today, there's also a producer in the room and we didn't mention was here today, Adam Carrero. Thank you for being here today and thank you for producing the show. And also want to do a quick shameless plug. If you guys haven't checked it out yet, we have a short film that just came out. If you enjoy horror films, we have a short horror film that just came out on the ECAT YouTube channel. It is called The Innkeeper. It was directed by myself, Joseph Taft, and these guys worked on the movie as well. So if you guys want to check that out, make sure to get on the YouTube and watch that. We're up to 1,000 views, so I'm super excited, and I hope that you guys all enjoy it.
The Little Shop of Horrors by Roger Corman. I guess we can talk about that first.
Yeah.
And this is not the first Roger Corman movie we've talked about on the Radiocast. He produced the movie Dementia 13, which we previously talked about. And I believe in that podcast, Ben referred to Roger Corman as potentially the most influential person in modern day filmmaking. A little about Roger Corman is, if I can find out where I put my notes on him. Oh yeah. He's kind of known. There's an unofficial term called the Roger Corman Film School because he mentors such filmmakers as Francis Ford Coppola, Martin Scorsese, Ron Howard, Jonathan Demme, Joe Dante, James Cameron, Jack Hill, and many others. He's also well known for helping many big movie stars get their start in the business, including, and I think most famously, Jack Nicholson in Little Shop of Horrors. He also helped start the careers of Bruce Dern, Dennis Hopper, Charles Bronson, Tommy Lee Jones, David Carradine, and Robert De Niro. He also was the one he also first distributed the films of Ingmar Bergman and Akira Kurosawa here in America. And he's also well known mostly, I think, for his B movies, because Corman was a guy who made films quick and he made them cheap. And I think Little Shop of Horrors might be the perfect example of that, because it was made at least, well, all the interior shots for this movie, like the scenes in the flower shop, were filmed in 2 days. And they were leftover sets from a movie he had just made called A Bucket of Blood. Mm-hmm. And he had 2 days until the sets were going to be torn down. So he decided to use those to film another movie.
Yeah, it's crazy.
In the interior shots, it kind of felt like a sitcom at times. You know what I mean? Like it was tight.
Yeah.
It
long takes,
mm-hmm. and like the comedic values. But especially when we were inside, I was like, this feels like a little sitcom, you know, more than a movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that kind of actually was part of the filming, because in order to save time, Corman had several cameras just running at once at the same time, capturing scenes from certain angles.
That's right.
And he didn't do any retakes. All the scenes we see are just the first take, I believe, just shot from several different angles at once.
Yeah, it's wild. He's literally getting one take, but multiple versions of the same take. So he's really maximizing the amount of, you know, his production value in terms of getting the most out of every single second on set. And I'm pretty sure they still felt that they were behind schedule, according to his standards.
I think Corman always felt he was behind. Like he was behind schedule. That's just like if you look into how he made movies, that's just kind of how he was.
Yeah. Busybody. I get that totally. So continuing on with Little Shop of Horrors, you know, you mentioned the Jack Nicholson cameo, which comes along later in the film and is really one scene that, I mean, we can get into it a little bit deeper a little bit later in the show if we want to go chronologically on the film. But that was a scene where it almost felt like the movie wouldn't really be, I hate to say, it was almost like felt like a deleted scene. Like I know it was there, but if you had deleted it, I don't know how much different the movie's going to be, because he already just had his epic duel with the dentist, which was hilarious. I was not expecting a duel to the death with the dentist in this movie, but it happened. And then Jack Nicholson shows up and he's being all crazy and awesome. It's giving me almost like, you know, Jack Napier Joker vibes from Batman '89, but he's acting all crazy. And but it didn't really feel like a scene that truly advanced the plot to be a real stickler about it. You know what I mean? Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah.
I know the Broadway version of the play, like they cut the character completely out. Like we still have the dentist, but not him.
Yeah, Wilbur. I still loved it though. I'm not saying it's not a good time, because it was a good time. It's one of the most enjoyable moments of the film. Not that it's not a good film. I enjoy the film, but Jack Nicholson, it's really cool to see him in that role.
No, that whole dentist scene was like, it was honestly one of my favorite parts. Even though his character, Jack Nicholson's character, had nothing to do with it. Like he didn't end up, you know, playing too much into the film. It was like kind of like a comedic horror film, but that was like the part where I was scared the most, because I don't know, the way Jack Nicholson played it, just his character of like he wants to go to the dentist, he was crazy. That was like, oh, this guy's kind of crazy and weird. You know, that was the one point where I was like, oh, this character's kind of creeping me out. But I honestly didn't even recognize. I knew Jack Nicholson was in the film. I didn't know that was him when I was seeing
No
him.
way.
So then at the end of the film, I'm like, where was Jack Nicholson? Had to look it up. I was like, oh my God, he was that guy. He was my favorite character. Favorite character that had nothing to do with the movie. But I thought the performance was fantastic.
It was wild. It was absolutely wild.
Yeah, I think that scene was there mostly just to get some more laughs of just this crazy guy who enjoys pain. And yeah, it kind of was a good precursor to Jack Nicholson's later career of just playing crazy psycho characters. It was a good, It was a good preview of that.
It's very funny. He always had it in him. You know what I mean? It was always there from the very beginning. That capability to play absolute nut jobs. Yeah, that was wild. But if we want to run it back to, you know, the beginning of the movie, you know, you got Seymour. Well, you really start the movie with Mr. Mushnick and Audrey, who are running this plant shop, and it's going all right, but they could definitely use a little more business. And then in comes old clumsy Seymour, who falls over himself every 3 seconds. He trips and falls, and they fire him pretty much they're trying to fire him right at the beginning of the movie, and they finally decide. Mr. Mushnick decides, "Oh, we'll give you one more chance." And Mr. Mushnick's played by Mel Wells, who I thought was so funny in this. He really like every time he's like the part about him saying, "Oh, like I'm your dad," or like you're my dad. But then, like halfway through, he's like, "Who's your dad? Who?" so much different stuff like that. He really did a good job of just playing that. I guess he's not literally the annoyed dad or like uncle, but it was kind of given that vibe. He definitely played that character to a T.
Yeah, I enjoyed the character of Bushnick a lot too, especially because, as mentioned, I'd seen the '80s musical version, and in that one, Bushnick has a much smaller role. He actually gets eaten by the plant very early on in the movie.
Okay.
Basically, what happens to later in the movie where like that guy tries to rob the store and is tricked into walking into the plant. That's spoiler alert. That's what basically happens to Mushnick in the '80s movie.
Right.
So surprised by how much bigger of a role he had in this movie and how funny he was. He
was like integral. You know what I'm saying? He was like right there throughout the entire thing, and it was probably surprising to people that watched that version that you're speaking of, the '80s, and to be like, "Whoa, like what?"
Yeah,
he's gone. It was like a reversal of expectation.
Well, yeah, because in the '80s version, his cat is a bit more of a jerk, where like he finds out Seymour is feeding people to the plant, and then he kind of like pulls a gun on Seymour and is like, "Hey, I know you're killing these people, but this plant's making me a lot of money, so I'll let you walk away, but you have to teach me how to feed it. But you have to teach me how to take care of the plant." And Seymour's like, "Well, if you just walk over here, you'll see," and gulp, he gets eaten.
Yep.
Well, that was one of my favorite like developments from the Mushnick character. Was like he finds out that the plant's killing people, and then it's like almost like a moral battle at that point. Like, okay, am I going to get the money from the plants? Am I going to turn it in? So I thought that was a good conflict. Like good part of the movie.
I agree.
His character brought in.
It was strong internal conflict that I wasn't necessarily expecting. Like you hear, like, oh, it's just like this B movie. I knew that of course Roger Corman has made some well-known ones, but I mean, I was like, wow, like these characters are really like at odds with themselves, and you can see like how the fame changes Seymour throughout the film. He's got girls all around him, and he's got the newspaper coming to write stories about it, like the TV stations coming to shoot, like all this stuff. And yeah, it's really funny. But then I try to, when you piece together the entire thing and all these characters and all these different going all these directions, and then you just have Jack Nicholson's character, you know what I mean, which is just a
complete wild card.
Yeah, but it is almost like the beauty of a character who just, like you said, just wants to be like beaten up.
Yeah,
and just be the punching bag.
And kind of fun fact about the Jack Nicholson scene is that it was supposed to, according to Jack Nicholson, the scene was supposed to go on a lot longer. But in this film, when like Seymour, after killing the dentist, he ends up pretending to be the dentist so he doesn't get caught when Jack Nicholson's guy comes in.
Right.
And he's like pulling teeth out of Jack Nicholson. The scene kind of ends abruptly when Seymour was pulling a tooth. He falls back out of screen and it kind of fades to
knocks the dentist thing over. Yeah.
What happened is the actor who plays Seymour was not supposed to fall down, but he accidentally fell back and knocks over a piece of equipment that the crew had rented from an actual dentist. And this piece of expensive equipment starts falling over, and off camera, I guess Roger Corman just ran to the set and caught it. Then he's like, okay, we're moving on to the next scene.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, but the scene was supposed to go on longer. But then that happened. Corman's like, okay, next scene, we're moving on.
Funny because that fits the character of Seymour. You know what I mean?
Because he kept busting it all over the set. You know what I mean?
Which, by the way, I liked his character. I found him so sympathetic and like he just wants to do right. He's just like, I don't want to kill these people. No. You know what I mean? I really liked him.
I agree.
And most of the kills he does are maybe with the exception of the dentist, all the kills are accidental because the first one is just this guy, he throws a rock, this guy just pops out of nowhere, gets hit and stumbles in front of the train. The dentist, Seymour, you could argue the dentist was kind of self-defense because that guy was trying to torture him.
100%, yeah.
And then later with the sort of a call girl character at the end, again, it's kind of an accident. He throws a rock in the air, it just hits her in the head.
But also, technically, the other person that got eaten was not of Seymour's doing. It was Mr. Mushnick who got the actual I'll jump the gun and say the screenwriter
I know.
of the film who plays a mugger.
Who's also the voice of Audrey the plant.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yeah, he gets himself eaten, Mr. Mushnick. And I thought that was hilarious too, how he was able to turn the tides and be like, well, let me use this to protect my shop and I thought that was kind of cool. Even though he was at odds with it internally, it was a cool way to show all of that. Definitely a lot going on personally with the characters in this film, more than you would expect necessarily, which I think was really funny.
Yeah, and also just kind of speaking of some of the side characters I liked, we talked about the dentist, Jack Nicholson and Mushnick. Yeah. A character who really stood out to me is, I didn't write down the character's name, but I wrote down the actor. It was the character played by Dick Miller, who just kept coming into the shop just to eat flowers.
Yeah, he just put salt on them.
That character might have been my favorite character.
Wild.
Of just how what the WTF. I just felt when he just walked in, he was like, hey, I want this flower. Mushnick's like, oh, here you go. And the guy's like, thanks. Pulls out his salt shaker and just starts eating them. Like every time that character showed up, I laughed.
Yeah, there's some random funny characters like that. You had him, and then you had
I like the woman,
the woman who would walk and be like,
observer. She wasn't negative or positive towards any plants, just observes. I thought that was funny.
Yeah, and also there was also the old woman who kept coming in because
my something died. I need a free flower today.
Yeah, her name was Mrs.
Like, take anything you want. Oh, how about the cash register?
He's like, her name was Mrs. City Shiva, which is sort of a play on the Jewish ceremony of sitting Shiva, which happens. I might be, correct me if I'm getting this wrong. I don't know, someone in the comments, I don't know, but like part of the funeral process for Jewish and the Jewish tradition is like sitting Shiva is like when you sit. That's part of the funeral process. So her name is City Shiva because her family members keep dying.
Oh my god!
Wait, so do they really keep dying? Because I thought she just kept coming in line.
I think she's a cheapskate.
Some flowers.
I thought which is kind of messed up if that's. Yeah,
because she keeps coming. She keeps coming, and it's like my cousin's nephew-in-law died, and then later on, with those two detectives, one of them mentions like, "Oh, my son died playing with matches," and then the other guy's like, "That's a darn shame." And later, when the detective and Mrs. Shiva are together, like she's like, "Oh, nephew, something. I'm so sorry to hear about your son." He's like, "It's okay."
Yeah, that was wild.
Oh, I think the line was, that's the breaks. I just remember loving the deadpan of all that.
And actually,
I had to run that part back because I was like, what did he say to her?
Yeah, and actually another connection between her and other characters, Jack Nicholson mentions his character. He mentions he's a mortician, I believe, or a pallbearer. He's something involving a funeral home. He mentions that he was recommended by her because he keeps seeing her at the funeral home.
Yep. Another character that I enjoyed was the mom. Was Seymour's mom. Mm-hmm. Like, I mean, you said you relate to Seymour. I mean, I relate to Seymour. I still live with my parents, so I'm like, come on. Like when he's like, why don't you go? When he's finally getting the end with Audrey, and he's like, we can have dinner at my place. Like, my mom will make us dinner.
I thought that was a funny scene as well.
Like, you know what? Yeah. Like,
he's like, I don't have any money. We can't do anything.
He goes, oh yeah. I forgot. I'm broke. Why don't we just go for a walk down by the way? Well, what if we have my mom make dinner? While she like completely like despises the kick. What about when she kicked him? Do you remember that part? That was wild. It was like actually well choreographed. It was like he got knocked down and everything. That was really funny. Yeah, there were a lot of randomly really funny and kind of deep parts in this movie that I appreciated. Didn't expect it necessarily, but overall, it was enjoyable for me, and I think you guys feel the same way. I know we have a lot to say about Night of the Living Dead, so we were probably gonna dedicate a decent amount of time to talking about that film, but I know there's probably a little bit to say about Little Shop of Horrors and just the cult following and just how kind of it grew with popularity over time. So I think it's probably worth mentioning a little bit.
Oh yeah, it became very popular after it was made. It became a cult classic, and as you know, it was made, as I mentioned, it was made into, in the early 80s, it was made into a Broadway musical. Not quite sure why, but and then it was later in 1986 adapted into a film, which which was directed by Frank Oz, who did a lot of work with the Muppets. He was the voice of Yoda. So, and the puppet work of Audrey the Plan in that film, it's some of the best puppet work I've ever seen in a movie.
Crazy, yeah, crazy.
And if you haven't seen the 80s film yet, I'd recommend it. It's got a big cast. Seymour is played by... oh, sorry, my phone. It's played by Rick Moranis, who you might know from Ghostbusters. The crazy dentist is played by Steve Martin. Jack Nicholson's character is played by Bill Murray.
Yeah.
John Candy's also in it. It's got a big cast.
Wow.
Yeah.
And also was spawned, I believe, in the early 2000s, 90s. There was an animated TV show based on Little Shop of Horrors, and it played a lot on TV. And the reason it's in the public domain is because Roger Corman, he made this movie. He didn't think it was going to be a big hit, so he didn't even bother applying for copyright. So probably after it became very popular, he probably really regretted that.
Oh yeah. Absolutely, it became massive. They immediately went on to make the musical about it. Like, yeah, it wasn't like it was a book prior. You know what I mean? A lot of the things we talk about are adaptations already. You know, how many we're gonna get into Night of the Living Dead and how that used that classic novel as inspiration as well. But Little Shop of Horrors was just an idea, by Roger Corman and Charles B. Griffith. And then the next thing you know, it becomes like a thing where still to this day in 2009 and 2016, there were rumors of remakes and new versions.
Yeah, they keep talking. Every few years, people talk about how they're going to make a remake, but then it never really happens. And I think something that
could be for the better, but you never know.
Yeah, but something that I do just find interesting about Little Shop of Horrors is that most people, I believe, at least of our generation, they know about the 80s movie, but they know more about the remake than they do about the original. Yeah, which is something that most people that you can't really say about too many movies when the remake is more popular than the original.
Yeah, it's kind of like a shockwave, right? It's like there's the initial impact of the film, and then like all of the residuals are what get remembered. Yeah. Like even my dad, who was born in 1969, like he didn't even know about the original. He thought that he's like, oh, the one when I talked about what we were watching for this month, he's like, oh, you mean the one from the 80s? Like, no, we're going back. So he wasn't even aware. But yeah, I think we can probably get into Night of the Living Dead a little bit. I mean, we're talking about like I said, a game-changing horror film, an independent film that George Romero put together. He created Image 10 production company just in order to make this film, put this film out, and had $100,000 budget and turned that around real quick for quite a nice chunk of change, $30 million worldwide, which I'm sure accounting for inflation would be quite a bit of dough nowadays.
Yeah, it's actually, I read it grossed approximately $30 million, which is the equivalent of $247.8 million. Yeah. At least in 2022.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, they rented a farmhouse that they planned on, destroying throughout the entirety of the production, and they pretty much did so, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I mean, you have Dwayne Jones in the lead role as a character who throughout the film isn't actually named. You don't really, if I'm not mistaken, you don't get his name until the end credits. You just kind of
he might have said it. He might have said it to Barbara when they first met. It's like, "Hi, I'm Ben," but yeah, I can't recall exactly.
I'm not recalling.
I didn't know his name throughout the film. Yeah, I didn't know it.
Yeah, while the other characters are all referring to each other as Karen and different things like that. And so, we have different characters throughout that do make an imprint, but Ben is certainly the one that leaves the best imprint. And there's a story about when George Romero cast him. People asked in retrospect if he was looking for an African-American actor, and he said that he really just cast Dwayne Jones because he was the best actor for the role, in his opinion. And all of the talk after the film, analysis of the film that might include any kind of like political weight, he really attributed to just, well, he cast the dude that was best for the role. And that was always going to be, I know spoilers or get right, because it's just so clear and out in the open, the end of the movie and how it ends, because it was such a shock and reversal when Ben is shot by the, I guess you call them, they're not really the police, they're just
A posse of rednecks, kind of.
there you go.
I was gonna say militia,
Yeah.
but I like your phrase.
yeah, like government almost funded militia, where they're like, yeah, pretty much just they're there to save the day, and you feel like, oh man, it's all good, but there's something, they're not playing happy music or anything as you're getting into that last couple of minutes. But yeah, it's like the fact that they, just gunned him down after all of that without even offering to see, like, if it's bizarre, it's wild, and it's awesome, and that's why the movie lives on today. Not necessarily the only reason, but one of the key reasons. So if you guys want to mention anything about that.
Yeah, so there's actually a story that when Romero and people were looking for like distributors for the film, they approached American International Pictures, who said they would distribute it, but they wanted Romero to reshoot the ending to have it be happy. So Romero refused to do that. So
Right.
he went looking elsewhere. And yeah, like kind of shifting a little bit. I mentioned that I've seen this movie before. I believe all three of you mentioned this was your first time seeing Night of the Living
Yes.
Dead.
Yep.
I was just curious to hear like what your thoughts were like seeing it for the first time and whatever you heard about it previously.
Well, I knew it was like responsible for a lot of zombie tropes, but like looking up, it was like, oh, that's responsible for all of them. I didn't realize like, oh, this created like the genre, like
Yeah, as we know it.
yeah, it was just like, oh, that's where everything came from. Okay, yeah.
Absolutely changed the game. Like I said, he didn't refer to them as zombies in his whenever he spoke about the film. He called them ghouls because zombies up to that point weren't known for being what he put to screen. But then after that movie, it just got into the public zeitgeist that, yeah, that's what a zombie is, and that is what it is from now on.
Yeah, because before this, traditionally zombies, the word zombie itself and the concept of zombies originates from the Caribbean, I believe, like voodoo practices and beliefs, where a zombie was a corpse without a soul that would basically be brought back to life by like a voodoo, a witch doctor or something, and basically would be that person's undead servant. And there were several films made basically with zombies with just these corpses brought back to life to be like slaves, and never before had they been depicted as like these flesh-eating undead creatures. Night of the Living Dead was the first thing to do that. And something that I always just found interesting is that when this film came out, the mainstream version of zombies were, again, these undead corpses brought back to life through voodoo, and the non-mainstream one was the flesh-eating undead creatures. Nowadays, that flesh-eating undead creature is the mainstream zombie version.
That's right. And I mean, you look at every zombie movie across the board, it's like they use, I mean, nowadays, maybe not necessarily now, but you'll see a little bit that comes from this, not just maybe this movie, but the franchise, because Romero ended up putting together a 5-movie franchise, and that's just the original run. There were a whole bunch of remakes by him and not by him, and also, like, I mean, what isn't a play on, like, most zombie content nowadays is like a play on something of the something dead, you know what I mean, like the something, The Walking Dead, you know what I mean. Which that's a wild story, the creation of that IP, but that's another day. But yeah, it does seem like it's influenced everything.
Yeah, because Joe, you mentioned like zombie tropes, that this invented it. I kind of made a list of some of the ones it invented was like zombies as slow-moving undead creatures, which you mentioned The Walking Dead. When they were making the show The Walking Dead, one of the producers said that the zombies they had in those shows couldn't move any faster than, say, the ones from Night of the Living Dead. They said they couldn't move faster than like the Romero zombies.
Right.
And so they said like, in that
Like they set a baseline for
yeah,
themselves.
yeah, they said that the Romero zombie was kind of like the baseline for how they were going to depict zombies or
Okay.
walkers as they called in that. And like also this movie invented like the idea that you can only kill a zombie by destroying the brain.
That's right.
Like if you get bitten by a zombie, you'll turn into one, or just sometimes if you just die in general, you'll become one, which again is something that The Walking Dead would also borrow.
That's right.
And also things like zombies being scared of fire, that's something that would be a recurring theme as well.
Yeah. It really is. It's extremely influential, and in just the way that these creatures are shown to us, and the way that, like we said, the way that the world reacted to them, and how now the mainstream and what was known as kind of the underground was completely flipped. And yeah, it's crazy. If anyone wants to talk a little bit about the plot of the film and just like the journey that it is Night of the Living Dead, that opening is a little wild if we want to get into that.
Yeah, so this film opens up with it kind of sort of pulls a bit of a psycho where it makes you think this person's going to be the main character, but then they end up not being it. We meet a pair of siblings, Barbara and Johnny, visiting. I'm not sure if it's ever explicitly said who they're visiting, but they're visiting a dead relative in a cemetery.
I think it's their father.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there's mention of the father in the scene.
And I remember like reading behind the scenes that cemetery, the opening cemetery scene was actually, I believe, the last scene they filmed from the movie.
Okay.
And Romero decided to choose a cemetery for the opening because he figured it would be isolated and they wouldn't be interrupted by people. And now that cemetery is a big tourist attraction because for fans for the movie. Yeah, so yeah, these siblings, Barbara and Johnny, visit their dad. Barbara mentions a story of like how Johnny, or was it someone used to jump out and scare her when they would come to this area. So Johnny kind of begins teasing her about it. In the distance, a lumbering Frankenstein-looking guy starts coming at them.
I love just how strongly it immediately hits at like basically is playing with like a child's fear is like the immediate trope that's going on here. And I appreciated that because it really gets to like the core of like what scares people and why, and just there's no reason to be scared of Johnny like in this sequence. Like, that there's this, like you said, big lumbering guy in the distance, but Johnny is just playing in a way that you can tell it's really getting on Barbara's nerves. And I just really appreciated the way that this is the way this movie opens, is like really primal in its execution, I would say.
Yeah, so this guy who we later quickly find out is a zombie, the first zombie we see in the movie, attacks Barbara. Johnny, who had previously just been teasing her, runs to her defense, and after a pretty violent struggle, they fall and Johnny bashes his head on a tombstone. And
gotta watch out for those.
A very kind of gruesome death for a movie from the 60s.
Yeah, there's quite a few of those. I would agree throughout the film.
Oh yeah, so this guy then begins chasing Barbara, who eventually finds herself in a seemingly abandoned farmhouse where she meets the character who then kind of becomes the main protagonist, Ben. And they fortify themselves as more and more zombies show up, but then they begin to realize that other people are in the house, particularly the basement. We meet more characters such as the Cooper family and a young couple, and there's this one kind of like the human versus human struggle, which is kind of again a big part of future zombie stories, where if humans could just learn to get along and work together, they could survive an apocalypse.
Yes.
But as we see here, especially between Ben and Harry Cooper,
they cannot.
They they immediately start butting heads, and this later leads to kind of leads to the deaths of everyone. Is I think the fact that these two two can't get along and can't seem to agree on the best way to survive.
Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, I don't know if that was necessarily ever even played with beforehand, but it is really interesting how the human conflict is what gets in the way of eventually. I mean, this is the first time that we saw zombies in that light. So to then take that and say, well, you could have made it, but you guys couldn't work together. It's a very interesting concept, and that is partially what I wanted to get into when we made our little intro for the for the actual episode of Old Time, because that is such a crucial element. When there's an apocalypse, I mean, look at the recent show, The Last of Us. You know, there's more human on human conflict than there really is even with the zombies in that universe. There's a lot, but it tends to be kind of like oh yeah, the zombies, that's right, because really everything else was about to hit the fan, and then the zombies show up and kind of, I know it's a little bit later in the one of the, I'm being vague purposefully so we don't spoil anything about the show if anyone's not seen it, but there's a moment where like the human on human conflict rises, and then finally the zombies are actually what get them out of that conflict, which is really bizarre and an interesting like turn on what you'd originally expect from that trope. You know, the zombies are expected to come in and ruin everything, not actually to save everything. So just the amount that we've grown since this very film. I've seen Dawn of the Dead. I know you mentioned you've seen Night of the Living Dead quite a few times. I think you mentioned to me that you've seen Dawn of the Dead, right?
I've seen the first 4 Romero zombie movies:
Cool.
Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, and Land of the Dead.
Okay, yeah. And then there was the 90 remake that he did of Night of the Living Dead, right? Or no, it was a Dawn of the Dead remake.
There was a 1990 remake of Night of the Living Dead, which was produced by Romero, but it was directed by his longtime collaborator, special effects artist Tom Savini. And it's kind of going back a little to Little Shop of Horrors. I mentioned that the remake of Night of the Living Dead is kind of more Little Shop of Horrors is kind of more well known than the original. It's the opposite of Night of the Living Dead, where the original is so famous that everyone kind of seems to forget that there was a. Whenever I mentioned there was a remake, people were like, "Wait, there was a remake of it?"
Oh yeah, huh? There was a remake.
So it's kind of an interesting dual opposites of the remake being more famous than the original. Well, in this case, the original just outshines will kind of forever outshine the remake.
Yeah, they kind of operate on 2 different ends of the spectrum, you know, in like a lot of aspects. We said at the beginning of this how different these movies are, and you can see like not just from what you see on screen, but also the way they were received and the way that the future went for them. Because Night of the Living Dead, I guess, never really needed a true remake. Of course, they made Dawn of the Dead was great. You know, genuinely, that second Dawn of the Dead was great. And there have been, you know, the zombie as a character and as a trope and as a way of storytelling like has expanded so far beyond what it was in 68. But it's almost like this really was like, this is still fantastic. You know what I mean? While Little Shop of Horrors was good, but it clearly people were like, there's more here that we can tap into. Maybe not just necessarily for like making money, but like artistically speaking, like, you know, when things are shot like a sitcom, maybe people tend to think that way. I know I do, where I'm like, oh, there could be more here. And then, I mean, look at Frank Oz. He's one of the most creative dudes of all time. I mean, like, for what he does, it's like so fascinating. So it totally makes sense that that's the route that they would go. I mean, that's one of the cooler things of the 1960s. I know we're jumping between movies now, but like one of the cooler versions of Little Shop of Horrors is those plants. But we'll stick to Night of the Living Dead, and we can talk a little bit about, I think it'd be cool to talk about that human on human conflict and just the conflict of the basement, you know, being in the cellar versus being upstairs, and that line, which I love very much by Ben, which was, you can go be the boss downstairs, but when you're up here, I'm the boss.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear from you guys, like, who do you think was right in that argument? Do you think Ben was right to say, hey, we should at least be up here for now, or Harry Cooper, like, let's just stay in the basement?
I think Ben was being the more reasonable person. You know what I mean? Cooper was kind of like being a really dramatic, trying to get everyone in the basement.
Wanted
We
to be
have
in
to do this.
charge.
Where Ben is like, all right, let's look at our options here.
Mhm.
Up here, we can get out if they come in. You know, we have more options. Whether if they're down there, we're just stuck. So I kind of like Ben's point of view, even though in that situation, I'd probably be crawling in the basement, just locking up all the doors.
Yeah.
Fetal position. Feeble.
Ben was right, but had they all gone upstairs like he was suggesting, they probably would have all died sooner, given that the Cooper's daughter was slowly turning into a zombie at that point.
That's
True.
right.
And
Yeah.
but then again, if they had all been in the basement when she turned, that could have turned into a chaotic situation as well, because Ben might have tried to put her down, but her father and mother
Wouldn't have been into
wouldn't have
that.
been into it, so that could have also led to disaster.
Oh man, I never thought of that.
Another interesting
Wow.
aspect is that Ben wants to like be upstairs because he's saying like the basement. He basically wants to use the basement as a last resort.
He's
and
like, we can
that-
go down there if we have to. You know
if we
what I
have to. He wants options,
Mm-hmm.
but it's kind of like it's staying in the basement is what ultimately saves him at the end. He's the only
Yeah.
person in the house to survive the night. He doesn't survive the morning, but he survives the night by kind of doing what Harry said. So it's kind of interesting
Yeah, man.
resolution to that conflict.
It's sad. It's like ironically sad. You know what I mean? But it, the movie is called Night of the Living Dead, not morning after the Living Dead
Yeah.
attack.
Oh, that's Dawn of the Dead.
Yeah, exactly. No, it was so sad, and I actually was privy to the way that it was gonna go before the movie. I knew a couple things about the movie going into it, and I did know that Ben was going to die at the end, because what happened was I actually thought that was how Dawn of the Dead, the one in the mall, was gonna end. And so I spent that whole movie thinking that he was gonna die at the end, and then he didn't. So spoilers. And I was like, oh, wow, I totally expected. But then I knew that because for some reason I saw that one first, and then I saw Night of the Living Dead just recently. So I knew, I'm like, yeah, this isn't gonna go well for him. But my mom was watching it with me for the first time ever as well, which is kind of interesting too, because she was also born in '69, and so for her to just see it for the first time, and she knew, she's like, they're gonna shoot him, like he's not gonna, this isn't gonna end well. There's definitely a feeling as you're going through, like, because you're like, the movie should be over, like, can we like wrap it up? But you just keep following this militia, as you kind of referred to them as. And oh my God, their like smugness in the way that they respond to the reporters and stuff about how they could, we I can't.
They seemed like they had it under control. You know what I mean? They were fooling me. They're like, listen, we can just take care of them. It's no big deal. It's like, I want to go where these guys are.
Yeah,
Wherever they are.
shoot
Go
them once,
find
shoot them
them.
twice, they'll be done. Yeah.
They were not scared whatsoever.
No.
Yeah, there's a lot of Joe kind of mentioned this. There's a lot of critical analysis about the ending, and particularly Ben's death of like because basically it's like this posse of rednecks, white men see this black guy, don't even ask questions, they just immediately shoot him, just thinking he's a zombie. And a lot of people have analyzed like, was that intent? Yeah, because Romero would go on to say that any like racial themes in this movie were purely incidental on his part. And like you had that ending, and then like Ben is shot, and then the film kind of cuts to these like still like
that's right,
like freeze frames of just this posse
credits
coming in and dragging Ben's body out and burning it.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear what you thought of like the use of those frames at the end.
I thought it was a powerful ending. I didn't expect it, but it kind of towards the end of the movie, like you said, like, why isn't this wrapped up? Like it felt like it was heading that way. And I don't know. It was just like, I was just in shock and awe while those frames were happening, not of them specifically, but just of interpreting everything I just saw.
Right. It definitely had a grim feel to it, which I think is kind of what's given the movie some lasting power, that it was like, as you said, he did not go for the happy ending.
No.
Like just it's over. That's all
right.
you're getting.
Yeah, and like kind of those freeze frames of his body being dragged out again is another point that, because I actually in college wrote a paper on Romero's movies, and I read a lot of analysis of this movie, and a lot of people have like drawn connections between like those freeze frames of Ben's body being dragged and like images from like the 50s and stuff of of like race crimes and like, not to get a little too dark, of like sort of like lynching photos. There's been a lot of people comparing the images from the end to those.
Yeah.
And again, Romero would say that was incidental because the reason those kind of grainy freeze frames are in the end is because they ran out of film stock at the end.
Okay, yeah. I
Yeah,
had to mention. Yeah, I'll let you finish your thought.
Yeah, like they ran out of film stock at the end, so they just decided to take photos of his body being dragged out and put that in, and it ended up like kind of like in Jaws where the shark isn't seen because the thing kept breaking, but that ended up kind of making it even better. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like this budget issue happened, but it kind of ended up making the movie stronger.
I agree. It gave that ending a different feeling. Like, you know, because it's not literal rolling film. It's like screenshots, you know, still images. You get that feeling of like, oh, you know, just like that really just happened, and it's like almost like photographed in history in a way. But the way that the music comes in and the way that the imagery is shown, a lot of like shaky, like the shots aren't perfectly still, you know what I mean? Like the feeling of it is just, it feels a lot different than the rest of the movie, and that's why I feel like I feel like Romero really made something that was like he knew what he was making, and it's okay, you know. I think that it was telling a very important story, you know what I mean? So I think that I understand why he said what he said and why he did what he did. And of course, if he cast a white man as that character, it probably still would have ended the same way, but I don't think it would have hit the same way for the audience, for the viewer.
Yeah, because some of the thing is like Dawn of the Dead and all of his future zombie movies are kind of full of social commentary, especially Land of the Dead and Day of the Dead. So I kind of wonder if like the critical response to this movie where everyone was kind of like analyzing it, if that kind of inspired him to do more. Yeah, because Dawn of the Dead takes place in a mall where you have like zombies wandering aimlessly around a mall, and Romero has said that is like a criticism of just consumerism, Americans mindlessly walking around a mall and like consuming whatever they want. So like, and that's just one of the critiques.
It's totally fair. I mean, I didn't really think of Dawn of the Dead in that way until he said it, and then I was like, oh, you know what? Like, that is what we do at the mall, isn't it? Yeah, you kind of just walk
around and look for something to get.
Where's the food court? Yeah, no, that was an experience watching this movie. I mentioned to you that in the weeks just following this viewing, I saw 2001: A Space Odyssey for the first time, which is a film that came out, I believe, in 68 or 69, right around that vicinity. And even though that was also like Kubrick made a landmark film there, like it also changed the game of, you know, not just that genre, but film forever, in a way that I would say this movie did too in its own right. But this movie, Night of the Living Dead, just kept me hooked. There was not a single minute that I wasn't enthralled by the movie on my first viewing. Like, while 2001, I mean, not to speak down on it because it's a crazy film and it blew my mind, but like there were parts where I was like trying to stay up through it, you know, like while this movie, there was none of that. I was like, the whole time I was totally enthralled beginning to end, and even in the end I was sitting there pretty much just like jaw on the floor with that ending, even though I knew it was coming.
I'm curious, did you feel the same, Jack?
Yeah, I was interested the entire time. I think the conflicts that were happening were like kept me into it with okay, what are they going to do? Are they going to stay in the basement? Are they going to go upstairs? Are they going to go outside? Are they going to leave? Are they going to try to find that shelter that was mentioned on the news and all that?
That's right. So Willis.
Right. So all those conflicts. And then on top of that, the zombies. You have zombies and then those crazy internal conflicts. So all of that kind of kept me in it. And I was like, okay, how are they going to get out of this? And then it became from how are they going to get out of this to, oh, they're not going to get out of this. No. You know what I mean? And it was a cool way to transition into that.
There's one more mention I have to make about just the logistics of how this movie works and why I appreciate it. In the beginning sequence, Barbara is running away from that zombie, the first one, and she gets in the car but Johnny's got the keys, so she can't start the car, and so she's kind of just hiding from him. But then she decides to like throw it in neutral and have it like roll, or like whatever she does to have the car roll down the hill, which was great. But then it like kind of like crashes into the tree a little bit, but like only in a certain way that her door rolls up against the side, so she can't get out of her door. At that point, because I had seen, I just wrote it down, the I Am Legend remake that we watched, Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price. Like in a movie like that, for example, I felt like that would have been Barbara's end, where she would have been like, the zombie would have came up to that door and she would have been like trying to get out of the door that's already like stuck, you know what I mean? And like, but the choreography of it, I feel like was way smarter, where like she was able to, you know, she just gets out of there, out of the other door and runs. So it kind of like broke my expectations of this being just like a 1960s movie where some of the choreography is a little bit half baked and like, oh, she probably could have just crawled out of there. Well, yeah, she did, you know, and it, from that point on, I'm like, okay, like this movie's not really playing around in that regard. Like it feels real. Like it's not like they're hamming it up for the cameras necessarily, is something I wanted to mention. And yeah, I mean, we could talk about I Am Legend, and not only I Am Legend, but also Last Man on Earth, because this was also based on the same novel that those were, I Am Legend by Richard Matheson.
It wasn't technically based on, but it was definitely
an adaptation.
Romero it wasn't an adaptation, but Romero was very honest with saying that he was inspired by the idea.
Fair.
He got the idea of like the walking like undead from the book I Am Legend.
Yeah,
and he was kind of he was very open with saying like, oh yeah, I totally followed the idea from that. And
yeah,
I believe Matheson, he had kind of a less positive view on it. He said it was more of theft than a homage, so he wasn't as happy about it.
Wow. I mean, I get it, because at the time, right, you'd be like, that's my world that you just created, but that you just took. But like at the same time, it's not like he did like the I Am Legend story is very specific, you know what I mean? And that's not what this was. This was a survivor story. Like this is like, it's almost like he was like operating within the universe that had been created by like Richard Matheson's book. Like it's almost like this was like this could have happened on that night in his eyes, in George Romero's eyes, right?
Yeah.
Other than necessarily like the flesh eating, which we didn't see in
Last Man on Earth.
Last Man on Earth. Sorry, I keep forgetting the name of that movie, but yes, The Last Man on Earth with Vincent Price, our favorite. That was a good one. I enjoyed that though. I did enjoy it. Not, you know, it's just, you know, you see this one, it's like, oh man, this movie aged quite well, I would say, while the Vincent Price one maybe not quite as well.
Absolutely. There were some shots in this movie that were pretty like grotesque. Like, I don't know, at the beginning, the mother, the what's her name, Barbara's mother, when she came home and found the corpse that had all been.
That wasn't actually Barbara's house.
Was that okay?
That's just a random house.
Okay, I thought it was her house that she went home to, but the person in there that was completely eaten, and you get the close up of the skull. Or what got me was when the girl turns into a zombie in the basement and then comes at her mother with a knife. That was a pretty cool scene. So some like even for 1969, you know what I mean?
I was shocked.
I was like, oh, this is a lot.
I was kind of wanted to touch on the violence of this movie and kind of how impactful that was, because there's a quote by author Tony Williams where he said about Night of the Living Dead that, quote, "It is now popularly regarded as the film that introduced gore and special effects to the contemporary horror film." And Night of the Living Dead is unrated, but I think that it was one of the films that helped that helped encourage
the rating system.
Right? Yeah, because
like we can't let them get away with this.
Yeah, because another quote and kind of story I wanted to tell about this movie was when it came out and when Roger Ebert went to see it, there were a lot of children in the theater because at the time, because in the 60s you had films like Little Shop of Horrors, which is kind of a much goofier, like funnier film, and that's kind of what audiences sort of expected horror movies to be. So they were fine with like little kids going to see them. And Roger Ebert has this quote like about the movie. He says, "The kids in the audience were stunned. There was almost complete silence. The movie had stopped being delightfully scary about halfway through and had become unexpectedly terrifying. There was a little girl across the aisle from me, maybe 9 years old, who was sitting very still in her seat and crying. I don't think
Yeah.
the younger kids really knew what hit them. They were used to going to the movies, sure, and they'd seen horror movies before, but this was something else.
Now, isn't that just delightful?
Yeah.
Like, you know how happy that probably made George Romero?
Oh, yeah.
He's probably like, oh my gosh, it worked.
Yeah.
Like, okay, honestly, for that little girl who was 9 years old, like, she probably had a tough time that day. But can you imagine like how impacted she probably was by that movie? I mean, maybe she was scarred. Maybe she never wanted to see another horror movie again. But there's also the inverse. Like, could have changed her life for the better. You know, like, I mean, we're talking about a movie that. Imagine seeing that when it came out, and just being like, you know, being accustomed to what had existed up to that point, and then seeing that. If you can still make viewers in 2023 who are used to, you know, $100-200 million blockbusters that, you know, cost more for one shot than this movie did, period, and they kept me entertained and enthralled for the entire runtime and enough to be able to speak about it for so long, is like, it just goes to show.
Yeah, I can kind of attest to that because my brother and I saw this movie when we were very young. We were kind of going through a phase of watching like the old Universal horror movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and heard about Night of the Living Dead. Like, oh, this is another old horror film. Let's watch that. And we were expecting kind of a goofier, more campy film like those, and it freaked us out when we saw this for the first time. I can't remember how old we were. I think we were in elementary school when we saw it, and I can attest to the fact that this would scar kids who had
You
seen
were that
it.
little girl.
Yeah, we were that crying. It didn't make us cry, but it definitely creeped us out.
That's awesome, though. That's awesome. Were you? What do you think, Jack? I mean, for a movie from 1968, it's like crazy. Just like you said, the stabbing sequence. It's like they went so far,
Right, like
but did it in such a good
certain
way.
shots, and then also just like the terror and the stress and the angst that is among all the characters the entire time, that adds into it too, because you know, I think the acting was done so well by especially Ben,
Yes,
you know, the main character,
yes.
but of like, what are we gonna do, how are we gonna get out of this, and that
Yes.
adds into all those, you know, terrifying shots and sequences, and it makes you feel the stress that all the characters are feeling. So I really like that.
Totally agree.
And I think another thing that plays into that is, I know it's kind of a trope nowadays that people look back and like, oh, I don't like to watch old movies that are in black and white, but I think Night of the Living Dead, that is one of those films where if it had been in color, it would not have been as impactful. Versus, I think it being in black and white only makes the shots even creepier looking.
I agree.
Yeah, especially looking back, you know, now that we're used to a world without black and white, you know, it aged well, and I totally agree. I think there are colorized versions, but I don't know if they were well received. I know there were like, another thing that's interesting about this movie is the soundtrack, and how, if I'm not mistaken, the original soundtrack like isn't really, it wasn't made for the film, right?
Yeah.
It was bits and pieces of music that was basically public domain that they could use. It was from a library that was usable, and so if I'm not mistaken, I think this is along the right
Yeah, I believe
route,
so.
correct? Yeah. And so years later, they tried to do a soundtrack like all encompassing for like an own original soundtrack for the movie, but it just didn't really have the same feel that this one did. So I just think it's interesting. There's a lot of elements of the film that they try to redo, they try to make it better. There is the 4K print that that Criterion used for their version that was from the original film print. I want to get my hands on that.
Yeah.
I know we're getting to near the end of this wonderful Radiocast with all of you people. It's been a wonderful time. If there's any lasting thoughts that you guys want to give about either of the films. We lost Joe.
we lost
Joe, unfortunately, but he's off to do better things. Yeah. So, other than that, appreciate you guys being on today. It's been an absolute blast. If you guys want to check out any other Radiocasts, there is a back catalog on our website, eastoncat.org, or you can check out our YouTube. Other than that, hope you guys have a wonderfully spooky Halloween. Take it easy, y'all, and yeah. Signing off.